love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello and welcome to another SDA Q&A. I am your host for today, Peter Dixon, and it's great to be here and welcome everybody that's joining and those of you that are already here, my very special guests. And guys, I just realized I didn't even ask this before we went live. Is it Nennich or Nennich?
Nennich, you got it right the
Got
first
it right
time.
the first time. I should have just boldly gone, welcome, Terry and Carrie Nennich. So great to have you guys here.
Thank you for having us.
Yep.
You know, before we kind of get into your national employment and work as pastor for, I think, over 15 years, I want to just find out a little bit about you guys before you even met. So I don't know who wants to go first, but we're going to jump straight into it. Sorry, just before we do, a reminder that we've got Thursday Pacific time, California time, 6 p.m., our special weekly Good News Fellowship. And Emma Ray is our guest again, speaking on Romans. And tomorrow at exactly this time, we're continuing on number 2 of our 45th Glacier View Des Ford retrospective. Last week we replayed an interview that I did with Dr. William G. Johnson. Boy, it was a sizzler. That interview, season 2, episode 1, is really why we're still having these conversations in SDA Q&A to this day, because it just kind of a little explosion happened and it took off and there was a lot of interest. So we are revisiting that season, and tomorrow at this time I'll be interviewing Dr. John Godfrey, who was on the ground here in Australia when that all went down. And we're going to watch together his interview, which was number 2 in season 2. And he and I are then going to reflect on the conversation and his memories of 45 years ago, Des Ford, Glacier View. Now, you both would have been too young to really know what was going on about Glacier View, but we're going to find out a little bit about your separate history. Who's going to go first?
I guess I was nominated.
Okay, over to you, Terry. Tell us about Terry before Carrie.
Yeah. I was born and raised in a conservative Seventh-day Adventist family, 5th generation on my mother's side. So,
Whoa, now hold up right there. That's very interesting because, you know, a lot of us, it's interesting when Adventists use the generational. I was 5th generation as well. So you being younger means you would have gone even further back. So it's an interesting terminology that when we talk about that, because when people are Seventh-day Adventists, they use it as bragging. When we use it, we're going, even though we were that entrenched with it, we were able to still detach from the indoctrination. So can you just unpack a little bit of how far back that goes? Because I'm sure you've explored a little bit of your Adventist ancestry. Were there family stories at all about some of the early relatives of yours?
Not a lot. Goes back, it would have been my great grandfather and grandmother, I believe, both joined the church back in the early 1900s, and continued. Their children stayed in the church, and the generation stayed through my mother, who was an only child, all through most of the Midwest. Wisconsin is where my original family was from, and rural farmers there. And I don't know if I ever heard the story exactly how they joined the church. I think my great aunt had told me that it was through a pastor doing some local Bible studies or an evangelistic series back in the 1920s or 1930s.
Yeah. And it's usually some kind of charismatic, powerful preacher or dedicated elder or local evangelist or a big top coming to town. Yep. There's usually someone has reached out and convinced the person to become an Adventist. It's rare, I've found anyway, in my anecdotal experience, that people just stumble along and go, oh, that's something interesting I'd like to be a part of. It's usually someone that's gone out and done a little bit of work, telling them giving them a little bit of info and catching their attention, and then a little bit of reeling in. I've discovered with Adventism, there's a process where someone or an evangelist or a big top speaker does something that catches people's attention,
Yeah.
and then gradually reveals the deeper aspects of Adventism. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. So
I always was told that, and just born into that family. So from my first memories was going to church and keeping the Sabbath and following all the rules and regulations as my mom especially had been taught. My dad was actually raised Roman Catholic, and he went to Andrews University as a Catholic because he happened to be from Southern Michigan.
wow.
So my mom was an only child. And raised through all Adventist school systems, and went to Andrews with the hopes that she would find a good Adventist husband, and ended up dating my dad, who was a Roman Catholic at the time. And so
That would have caused some controversy.
Yeah, my dad joked until the day my grandparents died that they never forgave him or my mom for marrying him. But before my mom married him, he did get baptized and became an Adventist, and both my parents and as well as both my wife's parents and family still are active in Seventh-day Adventist churches. So even a bigger deal for us to kind of leave, because her family goes back 4 or 5 generations as well. So
at least 4.
Wow. So I wonder, you have mentioned in us discussing this conversation that some people are going to watch this and be a little bit surprised even that you have left the church. Do most of your family members know, and how have they responded to that? Then we'll get back to the history.
Go ahead.
Immediate family knows. I have a pretty large family on my mom's side, and I'm not sure how many of the cousins know. I mean, I'm not in a ton of communication with them anyway. So they might find out on Facebook when I share the video tomorrow morning or whenever I decide to share it. But I mean, it's been okay. I mean, it's been a real shock, especially on my dad's side. I'm one of 4 cousins, and I was the last one standing in the church, married to a pastor. And my grandmother passed away 2.5 years ago, and she would have been extremely disappointed, shall we say, that her Adventist granddaughter and her special grandson-in-law,
right,
as the pastor, she held him in very high esteem.
Was holding off making it public partly to do with her and maybe some other more sensitive family members?
Potentially. I'm not sure we really had totally come to grips with it ourselves yet.
Yeah.
And not really ready to answer questions. Still privately mulling things over.
Yeah.
So
in my case, I have a really small family. My mother was an only child. Her parents are both, my grandparents are deceased. My dad became a Seventh-day Adventist in college, and his family was Catholic, and he was the only person to become Seventh-day Adventist. So in some respects, he was kind of ostracized from his family when he left the Catholic Church. And so I've never really known my dad's side of the family at all,
right,
because of some of that distance, and they were in a different part of the country and such. So I got a brother and sister that continue to live in Minnesota. They both would probably call themselves Adventist. I wouldn't say that they're extremely active in the church, but certainly hold to some Adventist fundamentals that they were raised, that they haven't gotten away from. Probably the big one is a lot of the churches I pastored. I pastored in 9 different churches over a couple moves in a couple different districts, and we have not made that public, for most of them. And so there's a lot of people out there that I was their pastor who, if they happen to come across this, would be a
little bit surprised.
I'm sure.
It's interesting, and we'll dig a little more into this perhaps later. But when you say are a Baptist or Episcopalian, or over here we call them Anglicans, Uniting Church, Methodist, Presbyterian, if you move to another town and you you perhaps don't quite like your Baptist church that you go to, you'll just go along to another one and it's fine. I wonder why it is that, and this is the thing we can explore more. I wonder why it is with Adventists that it's such a big deal moving. Like yesterday, I went to we have a Adventist Development and Relief something. They do an amazing job locally, globally, nationally, internationally. It's like an op shop. We call them op shops, secondhand stores, thrift shops.
Thrift stores, Goodwill kind of is.
Yeah. And this is massive. It'd be the size of a football field. With clothes, and it's so organized and amazing. And I took my daughter there yesterday just to have a look, because they've got a great book section as well with kids' books. And I must have run into at least 12 people I know that are kind of my age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, that are working there, volunteering. And I had the best conversations, and I had the warmest feelings running into these Adventist friends who remain friends, and some of them look at me up and down a bit funny. But my point is that as we have this conversation, and all the conversations I have, we're definitely not attacking the person. We're talking about these ideas that we've just simply come to not agree with, and I think in many cases feel are a little bit harmful. And so when we talk about this idea of, if you leave the church, in other denominations, you can quite easily just go to another denomination and it's not a problem. There's something about Adventism that follows if you leave. There's a little bit of friction there, but fortunately, I think friendships can be maintained, maybe. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that it's not about bashing the people. It's about really looking at some of these doctrines and politics and things that can be harmful. But just briefly, what are your thoughts, both of you, on this idea that it's harder to just go to another town it's harder to leave the church and be accepted as opposed to being in another denomination?
Well,
Why
I
do you
think
that is.
Well, because when you grow up, especially being part of the system for me, it was 45 years. You're taught that the Adventist church is the only true church, and going to church on Saturday is a part of your salvation plan, And if you are not part of the Adventist church, and I think that's why so many times membership is left there, even though you haven't darkened the doors of an Adventist church in 10 years, your membership is still there, so you're still Adventist. I think it's part of the identity of being the remnant church, that you can't step away from that. And now that we've been out and we're attending a large non-denominational church, getting really plugged in with a lot of the really awesome ministries that they have, they look at you and they're like, so you left your denomination. And so one total sidetrack, I found my old baptismal certificate from when I was almost 12. And took a copy of it to a group that we're attending. It's a discipleship group. There's a men's group and a women's group. And I said, here's why we left, because there's a list of rules that you promised to follow on the back of it. And mine had the 27 fundamental beliefs, because back then there were only 27. And they're like, oh, well, that makes sense.
Yes.
When part of your baptismal vow is that you're not going to work at a place that sells tobacco or alcohol, and agreeing that the church has the gift of prophecy and is the remnant church, that makes sense, because most other denominations don't,
That's right. They don't stipulate that kind of really strict rule-based kind of promotion of their faith. Yeah, that's a good insight. It's interesting within Adventism, and I mentioned that we're looking at the Des Ford Glacier View era again tomorrow, and there's many Adventists that would call themselves, real true Bible-based gospel Adventists, and in many ways what they preach is not too far different from these other denominations that we speak
Yeah.
of, but they still, when push comes to shove, even though they'll say to you while you are an Adventist or to other people, "Oh no, we don't see ourselves as the remnant," and "Oh no, we're just really another Protestant movement that keep the Sabbath," and "Oh no, we don't believe in this kind of last day anti-Catholic, sort of belief system." Even though they say all that, when push comes to shove, they still feel very uneasy if you challenge beliefs or if you leave the church. So it's kind of like you can think
Yeah.
to a certain degree, but then there's this wall that stops you within Adventism from going too far.
No, that's absolutely true. And I would just reflect on what my wife said. It's that remnant theology that you're set apart, that you have the truth. And also the Sabbath is just the thing that absolutely unites the Adventist church. So if you go to another community and you're absolutely convinced that Saturday is God's Sabbath, there's very few other options out there. When we came to the point, maybe about 3 years ago, when we decided to look to attend another church, we just looked for something on Saturday because we still had that tremendous conviction that that is a Sabbath, and to worship on Sunday is the mark of the beast. And while we probably still didn't believe that, we still weren't at a point to cross that line. And so we're looking around, there's just very few other options. And it took us a couple years of finding some other churches that had Saturday services, usually Saturday evening, to kind of work through until we could finally come to the point. And it's just been within the last 8 or 9 months, we came to a point and said, hey, are we ready to worship on Sunday? Oh, no. and finally, felt that God had brought us to that point. And so we've connected with an awesome Christ-focused, evangelical, non-denominational Sunday church, which is on fire for Jesus, preaches the gospel, and it's been a great experience for us recently. But man, it's just been the last few months we've been able to cross that bridge, because even up until then, even though we had left the Adventist church and even dropped our membership, we still weren't at a point where we could go to some place on Sunday without really feeling that maybe we were even sinning, because Saturday was still God's Sabbath in our mind, because we were so indoctrinated.
Yeah.
And I was through seminary and 20 years of pastoral and church academy administration.
And then woven into that is Ellen White.
Oh, absolutely.
She is the perfume, the oil of Adventism.
That's so well said.
Yeah.
So just we'll go back again to learning a bit about you both. Meet Terry before Carrie and Carrie before Terry. But what I'll do is, instead of just having a Terry, you share, and then Carrie, let's go a bit of back and forth. So I want to take you both to just share a little bit. So we've established you both had, this generational Adventist. And Carrie, did you have any stories to share of any, family Adventism that was passed on down? Or
Yeah. So apparently, and I have seen a copy of this picture, and I should have reached out to my mom to see if she would email me a copy. But the very first camp meeting in the state of Wisconsin, they had a very long, remember the old school panoramic group photos? And my great grandparents were there, and my grandfather was a baby in his mom's arms. And so that was the very first Wisconsin camp meeting. Now, I don't know 100% if that was the first converts. I can't remember for sure, but I'm saying at least 4 generations. So I grew up right next to Andrews University, within 10 miles. So I grew up in an area where there's, within a 10-mile radius, probably 15 or 20, would you say, Adventist churches?
Yes, yeah.
So it was the Adventist ghetto, as we would say.
Very similar to here. Avondale and Andrews are often sister cities. And,
so
it's considered quite liberal, progressive, revisionist, gospel, big tent Adventism as well. The Andrews, then
Andrews University maybe, but a lot of the Adventism in Michigan Conference is much more conservative.
course, yeah, it's
you can
currently
find
going through some very interesting conservative battles right now.
man,
yeah,
yes,
sounds like it.
yeah.
Well, that's the same here. Where it's kind of the homeland of the liberal, progressive, revisionist, gospel, Big Tent Adventist, but it's also the homeland of the Standish brothers, the people that really influenced Herb Douglas, that influenced eventually others, that influenced David Asscherick and Doug Batchelor, and it's the home of that concerned brethren, they were called. So it's interesting, isn't it, that you'll have two universities, Avondale and Andrews, that are supposedly these beacons of progressive gospel Adventism, but they are often entrenched with incredible conservative fundamentalist Adventists,
Right.
traditional Adventists. Yeah.
I went high school for 3 years of high school. I went to Andrews Academy, which was their high school run by Andrews University. And I was just thinking about some things and how entrenched in Ellen White you were to a certain extent. The religion classes we could choose from, because there's about 300 students that attended there at the time. So you could pick a lot of your religion classes. And I remember one was Desire of Ages, Patriarchs and Prophets. So the Conflict of the Ages series was a religion class. You could get a religion credit for that. And Adventist history was a religion class.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to Adventist schools from first grade all the way until I finished high school.
Right.
So
wow. Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. And then I went to community college, which was only 45 minutes away from Andrews University, because I chose to become a dental hygienist, and the only Adventist college that offers that. So I was a bad Adventist and didn't go to an Adventist university, was Loma Linda. And I'm not going to travel clear to California. I'm a Midwestern girl. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to spend that kind of money.
So that might have been the beginning of the end. You went somewhere to major kind of challenged you a bit.
Potentially, because that was the first time in my life that I really interacted with people who were not Adventist on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But I still was going to church at Andrews, attending church services because I was commuting to school, still living with my parents. And I was told, I'm like, I should stay away from the seminary, because I did not want to marry a pastor. And I grew up in farm country, and I did not want to marry a farmer. And
ironically,
God looked at me and laughed and said, "Here's Terry."
It's 2 in 1, a farmer and a pastor.
Yes. Yep.
Kurt Bauer wrote a little bit earlier when we were talking about the gospel Adventist. He says there's no such thing as a gospel Adventist. One has to be deceived and not understand the gospel, or not understand Adventism. And I think it's something that lately has really interested me. So we will come back to that. So Terry, we'll go back to you. When you were a young Adventist, did you have this kind of Adventism, or the Sunlight? I can't remember the Sunlight book, but did you have that real scared of time of trouble, but probation closing Adventism, or was yours reasonably mild? Share with us, little boy Terry. What was that like?
Little boy Terry was too busy working on the farm.
I was convinced of the tenets. I don't know that I lived in fear necessarily, but I went through mostly public school. My family was raised on a farm, and so due to that, I did end up attending a small church school with 10 students, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. But the rest of my schooling early on was in public school. I remember, obviously, couldn't do anything on Saturday. I like sports, and I would participate in activities that weren't on Saturday. From my earliest days, I remember having public school lunch, but my mom would get the menu. They would print it in the newspaper the week ahead. And so any day there was pork on anything, I would have to bring my sack lunch from home. And so just always different. But I was proud of that. I was convinced that we were, the true church. And so I remember, especially in high school, standing up for my beliefs, for Saturday. And as I would interact with other public school students who were Christians, because I was living my faith as I thought, but I remember getting in animate arguments telling others they were wrong because, that they weren't following Jesus. And so I was passionate about my Adventist beliefs and how I was right and they were wrong. And I remember one particular time we had taken about a 4-hour bus trip. And on the way back, literally got in a shouting match with 2 other students whose dad was a Lutheran pastor. And so they were good Christians, and literally other students went to the front and back of a bus to get away from us because we were so animate, shouting and defending our beliefs. But, I was just absolutely convinced of that I was right and I had the truth, and they were going to go to hell potentially if they didn't come to understand the Sabbath because it was so critical. And so I was taught passionately that I had the truth and that I needed to share that. And I remember at that time I felt vindicated that I had witnessed for 4 hours, and then hopefully others had heard me sharing my beliefs. And
wow.
So I don't know that I had the fear, but my tremendous conviction that I was called to witness and share as I had been taught, and that really was witnessing about beliefs. Unfortunately, not as much about Jesus.
Yeah, and you did include there. Yeah, that's the other one I was referring to. Yeah, these two kind of both from your part of the world. Maybe yours more Midwestern, this one California. I'm not 100% sure, but both of these books.
I don't remember seeing that one, but it definitely could have been around.
Yeah, it depends on your generation. My generation were the Now ones, and your generation with that, because the lady that wrote Now took the church to court in the 70s with unequal pay, and she actually had a landmark decision made which changed the whole of Adventist pay scale. So when that happened, she settled out of court. Her book suddenly wasn't really sold much, and they wheeled out the next one, which was the one that you held up, the Sunlight Girl or whatever it's called.
This one was, I think, copyright 1980 is when this one was
yes,
published.
That would be perfectly timed. Yeah, the Now book began to fade around 81, 82. As I think she took the church to court 78, 79. There's a real Mary Kay McLeod is her name. And if you go online and look up Mary Kay McLeod Betrayed or Betrayal, there's an incredible book she's written about all of that, which she couldn't release at the time because of her out of court settlement. But Terry, you were saying there that as you were preaching and feeling this sense of conviction, you did have that sense of, hey, and if they didn't come on board with this special teaching, this special remnant version you had, they would lose their eternal souls. So you did have a sense of the gravitas of, boy, not believing Adventism means eternal damnation or eternal loss, separated from Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. That they were not being faithful, that they were not following his commandments, of course. And I would say at that time, I remember believing that they must not be truly converted or following the Holy Spirit, because if they were, God would lead them to truth. How could he not? As I understood it, because I had the truth. And so I was had a responsibility to share them, and they clearly weren't in tuning with God, because if they were, the Bible said that the Spirit would lead them to truth. And if they weren't following the Sabbath, clearly they weren't following the Holy Spirit.
And there's a certain higher moral ground that you feel as well. If people are totally honest, I remember, and Rochelle Anonymous writes, the pressure to witness everywhere you go at all times was so intense, always felt very performative, and from a place of superiority rather than actual love or care for people's souls. There was that little bit of smugness there. and that's
Unfortunately.
kind of in that pressure to do it. It was never. I never felt someone was saying, "Hey, now, but you." I don't know if your generation had it, but my generation, there'd be Sabbath school, and they'd hold. Someone would get up and say, "Hands up, clothes handed out, or articles of clothing given out," and they'd look, and there'd be 3 people put their hand up, and they'd tick it off, and
Yep. I remember
witnessing
that.
how many people witnessed to, and there'd be 5 people's hands and ticked off. So there was kind of a pressure there. But I remember being on a bus once coming back from Queensland to home, and as we pulled up, it was one of these kind of overnight things. This guy hops on, and he was as high as a kite, and I still had no one sitting next to me, and I thought, oh no, he's going to sit next to me, and I'm going to have to witness. and anyway, he sat down, and pretty soon, I said, asked him some questions, and he said, "Don't go any further. I knew you were an Adventist the minute I saw you." And I thought, what? This is like a bus trip. I had no Adventist sign on me, but Adventists do have a certain look about them. I've had people often say to me, "Yeah, you're an Adventist, aren't you?"
Mm.
Anyway, we're digressing a bit. So back to this early, Terry, at that where you had that conversation on the bus. That would have been more in your age 12, 13 kind of.
That was probably high school, so I was probably 16 or 17 at that point.
And what about you, Carrie? Did you have some early memories that were fearing the time of trouble and close of probation, or did you also more just come from a sense of feeling right about your remnant positioning?
I do remember, like, the Project Sunlight book. I remember reading it only once, and I've had it for a while, but I've never really felt compelled or didn't enjoy reading it. I do remember as a kid when you're outside, remember we're taught about the cloud the size of a man's hand that's supposed to come. I'm like, oh, there's a cloud. Maybe that's it, and you kind of get this, but then there's this sense of like, what if the last moment I die, I have a horrible feeling, like a horrible, like I'm driving my car and I go off the cliff, and my last moments before I die are not the best. Am I saved?
Wow.
Well, no, because I didn't have a chance to confess all the cuss words that I was saying as I'm driving into the tree. And that's not comforting at all.
You've just raised a really interesting point there that I don't think I've reflected on very often. Adventism blends the fear with an incredible kaleidoscope of excitement as well. The Lord's going to come back soon, and heaven's going to be amazing, and wow. And then there's the fear. They're coupled together. They're kind of married and marinated together. This sense of self-righteous, higher moral ground, excitement about heaven and the end times, fear of losing one's eternal life based on, did I swear too much or not? It's an incredibly potent mix. I've not really thought about that much before.
It's crazy making is what it is.
Yeah, yes, because people often defend, like, oh, but Adventism's got all this great stuff. Oh, okay, so you trot off over there and think about that. And then you have people going, but what about this? And so you tread off over there. But what you've made me realize there is they're so close together that what did you say? They're crazy making or something? It's
yes. Like, maybe we only say that here in the US, but it's going to make you go crazy.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Cray. Yeah. So at what age did you first meet?
I'm gonna back up just before we got there. A critical experience in my spiritual growth and whatever. Had that experience through high school. I actually remember talking to my parents when I was probably later in high school and saying, man, I actually believe God might want me to become a pastor, but I don't know that I could deal with the Seventh-day Adventist legalism. And so even though I was in the church and committed to it, I sensed that there was this legalistic law-keeping sense, and there was something wrong there. And so I remember that conversation was kind of a one-time thing and got away from it. Right after I graduated public high school, I was planning to go to the University of Minnesota, pursue an agricultural business degree. The week after, I went to a leadership conference I'd been elected to go to, and I met a girl who was in love with Jesus. And we kind of hit it off, and she just lived her faith, and I had my Adventist convictions, and we started dating, and I just had this conviction, man, I just need to show her a few Bible verses and she'll become an Adventist because she clearly loves Jesus.
Oh, right. So she wasn't Adventist. Yeah.
She was not an Adventist, but probably the most on fire Christian I'd ever met in my life up until that time. And the opposite really happened. She actually, I found out in hindsight, in the first 2 weeks after we met, she spent 80 hours researching Adventism because she didn't know anything about it. And if she wasn't convinced that it was Christian, she would not have had a relationship with me. And I think we were both 18 at this time. Maybe I think we were both 18. I may have been 19. What ended up happening is she continually challenged me in my faith. As I would share about this, she would challenge me about Jesus.
And she'd done her research.
She'd done her research. And through a process of a few months, I came to a point where I said, man, I'm Seventh-day Adventist. I'm passionate about it, but I really realize now I don't have all the answers that I thought I had.
Interesting.
And so I stepped back at that time and said, that Seventh-day Adventist was a religion of my parents. I appreciate that, but I don't know what I believe.
And you would have been about 18, did you say?
Yep, 18, just before I turned 19. And so as she challenged me, and I would attend church with non-Adventist churches with her and really heard the gospel, I would say, for the first time. Wow. And so I fully gave my life to Christ at that time. I read my Bible cover to cover in just a few months. I was going to church still on Saturday, but I was also going to church on Saturday night. I was going to church on Sunday with her. And when people ask me, what church, and I would say, man, I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, but right now I have no idea what I am. I know I'm a follower of Jesus. And during that time, I went from church to church about an 18-month period while I dated this girl, searching for truth. And so I went to Baptist church, Methodist church, Assembly of God, Pentecostal church, Nazarene church, just literally 25 different denominations, meeting with pastors and just saying, man, I'm studying, I'm searching. And every one of those, they would share, why they were Episcopal, why they were Baptist, and then every one of them, I would say, I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, and so, tell me why you go to church on Sunday instead of Saturday, because that was still, I couldn't get away from that, even though my relationship with Christ was strong, and I really had was born again, and not one of them gave me a satisfactory answer to that question. And so I still had this tremendous Adventist conviction that Saturday is the Sabbath, and there is something in the Adventist church.
Yeah.
And ended up coming full circle. I ended up breaking up with that girl. And then I actually got mad at God, in all honesty, because I was very, very hurt. I planned on marrying her at that time. And so I tried to run away from God, but ironically felt God's hand of protection over me. And then after a couple years, as I was finishing up my junior year of college, I just felt God reconvict me that, man, I'm back in charge of your life. And I went home for that summer, and ended up having a conversation with the Seventh-day Adventist pastor. I had just gotten a new pastor at my home church. I was away about 4 hours at college, so I didn't know him well. And I ended up breaking his leg in a softball game, and I went to visit him the next week, and we stayed up till like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was continuing to process this. And I remember him telling me, Terry, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has something special. It's the Remnant Church. You got Ellen White and the Sabbath, and at that point, it was enough to bring me full circle back to, okay, even though I love Jesus, the Seventh-day Adventist Church still is the remnant church,
Yeah.
and kind of
Yeah.
those earlier convictions, but I had a salvation experience that changed my life. And so I'm just realizing this term now in the last month or two, a gospel Adventist, because
Yeah.
I had an evangelical salvation experience that changed me. And I didn't realize how out of touch I was with a lot of the Adventism that I continue to encounter up until still encounter.
Yeah. In my season 2, where I was looking at the Des Ford Glacier View 40th anniversary, and we're now 45 years on. As I said earlier, tomorrow we will be interviewing Dr. John Godfrey and going back into that conversation and that information for people for the first time live to the general public. Season 2 is only available in the private group, so it's now getting out there to the general public, which I'm excited about. But I genuinely, even though I had left the church at that point when I did season 2, I genuinely was trying to help find this gospel Adventist. And because I did believe it was there and there was a gem of truth that could be nourished and spoken of highly, and that those who remained and were gospel Adventists, that they could speak and shout from the rooftops this beautiful gem of Adventism that had the Sabbath but seen in a proper perspective. And I, that season 2 is 86 interviews pretty much. It was a long season filled with incredible interviews with Adventist scholars and pastors and academics and people who'd been through the whole Des Ford righteous by faith. But in the last few months, I feel like that gem maybe doesn't exist. And I'll get a lot of pushback for saying that, but because I know there's people watching right now who I greatly revere and respect. Yes, you can find the gospel within Adventism, but I'm starting to think that there is no shred of actual gospel in Adventism. There's a difference.
I agree with you, Peter, especially over more recent reflection that Adventism preaches a different Jesus than the Gospels and Paul preached. And that's been a challenging thing for me to come to grips with, because my experience, I still was real, but it was different from Adventism. And as I went back for my senior year at the University of Minnesota, and I was processing what God wanted for me as I recommitted my life again after my little getting over hurt and stuff from a broken relationship, and said, God, what do you want? And I was looking at going to law school, possibly. I was looking at getting an MBA. I wanted some additional education after my bachelor's, and this idea of coming to becoming a pastor came up. And I remember sending for information from the seminary. At that point, I thought you had to have a theology degree to go to seminary, and I wasn't about to go and get another bachelor's. As soon as I got the information that a bachelor's degree would allow you to get into seminary, I had instant conviction that I needed to go to seminary and become an Adventist pastor. And so graduated from University of Minnesota on a Sunday and literally drove to Berrien Springs and started seminary on a Monday, the next day. And, found people who loved Jesus, but there was always these rules and regulations, which honestly, I've absolutely come to believe now are contrary to the gospel and compromise it. And it's a different gospel is my current conviction. And I know that's going to come across harsh and it's going to rile up those who are in the church. It would have riled me up if somebody had said that to me just a couple years ago, but where I'm at now, I see that I struggled in the church. I didn't struggle. Trying to find my words. And maybe we're probably getting ahead of ourselves as well from the story.
Well, I think it's clear to me that there are people within the Adventist church that have found the gospel, but they often then encourage others like you and me and you guys and myself, with this notion that stay in the church and help bring about change. But you can only hope to bring people to a better understanding of the gospel and Jesus' role in the gospel, but you can never hope to change the church itself, because the church at its very core is not even desiring the kind of gospel that really is the biblical gospel. So the gospel Adventists can be well-meaning, well-intentioned. We're not having a go at them. We're not having any kind of arrogance saying you can't find the gospel. You can find the gospel anywhere. But what we are saying is that you can only ever hope to shine that gospel and encourage other people to, and there might be a good role in that, but you can't try and trick yourself or deceive yourself that you can change the actual church. Rochelle Anonymous actually says a really good thing here. Anything good in Adventism is not unique, and anything unique in Adventism is not good. And a lot of these gospel Adventists often jettison the core doctrinal, Sabbath, wonderful, but not salvific. 1844, nothing supernatural happened that night, October 22. They jettison all these core unique beliefs. Well, therefore, you're just another Protestant movement. And if you're okay with that, good. And if you can be a little beacon of light to stop people from falling into the pitfalls, fine. But just don't deceive yourself that you're going to be changing the Adventist church. It is a very unique gospel, and it is actually very anti-gospel.
I absolutely did not realize that probably until the last year, honestly. So while I was in Adventism, I was trying to marry my gospel experience with Adventism, and I believe that they were synonymous.
Yes, good point.
And I did not realize the error just because I was trying to marry these different things as I was taught through seminary. And so I was convinced that Adventism was an evangelical church. Yeah. And we had the gospel and we had the Sabbath was the one unique thing. So even through seminary, I will say that I lost my, I no longer believe the Adventist church was the remnant. I believe the Sabbath was right, but I believe salvation was through Christ. It wasn't through the Sabbath, but I thought there was value to the Sabbath. And I remember in seminary, this is in the 90s, talking with several of my colleagues in lengthy conversations. And at that point, most of my good friends in the seminary did not agree that the Adventist church was the remnant. And so we went into Adventist ministry without the conviction of the 27 in reality. And I've run into very few. I want to be accurate. I've run into a lot of people who do not agree that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the remnant, but yet they believe it's special, and you got the Sabbath, and we got the whole Ellen White thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we continue. That's got many layers to it as well. So there's a lot of things there, but I was convinced that we were part of the bigger C church, I call it.
Yes.
And I was, so I continually tried to marry Adventism, and this would be very offensive to hardcore Adventists because now I'm crossing the line with the apostate Protestants, if you will. And so I had members who never liked me that much, and it was probably for that reason I didn't realize that how they saw me probably until more recently now, because core Adventism, that's a line you don't cross. Yeah. And because of my experience, when I was pastoring, I was always a member of the local ministerial. And so I had good friends with the Baptist pastor, the Methodist pastor, the Lutheran pastor in town. And I would often attend their church on Sunday as the Seventh-day Adventist pastor to develop relationships, to see where God was working, but also with the idea, maybe I can share with them about the seventh-day Sabbath.
Yes. Wow. It's you both of you have given me some new things to ponder. And Terry, what you've just said there is really fascinating and highlights this endless loop that if you find the gospel within Adventism, not because of Adventism, but you are within Adventism and you find the gospel, often nothing to do with Adventism that you found it. But you then have this conviction, though, to still minister and defend Adventism. And so you then you enter a loop where you want to marry, I like your terminology there, you want to marry these things together. Oh, we're not the remnant, but we still are Sabbath keepers. It's not salvific, but we still love Jesus. And you're trying to marry these two things that actually are chalk and cheese. And so here's the thing that you've just made me think of that has been, certainly anyone that watches the show regularly will notice I've been thinking a lot about this for 9 months. This, and gospel Adventists hate when I say they're gospel Adventists. That's why I kind of go liberal, progressive, revisionist, gospel, big tent Adventists. I'm trying to broaden the definition for them so they can feel a little bit more comfortable. But there's definitely this group of Adventists that try and marry these things together. And I now see that kind of thinking, not these people themselves, not criticizing them, but that kind of thinking that marrying the two together is possible is what is dangerous and harmful to the church. I like that I could have a chat to Doug Batchelor and hear what he says. He hears what I say. We're not trying to marry the two. We just disagree. And so we go our own way theologically. But these guys that are firmly entrenching in themselves into the Adventist church with a mission to marry the two together and bring young people into an understanding of, well, Adventists aren't really the remnant, and we don't really say Sabbath is a salvation. Oh, and the young people go, oh, good, well, that's great, that's the gospel. But then they find out that the Adventists officially teach that Sabbath is salvific. They are the remnant. The Sunday keeping is the mark of the beast. The seal of God isn't the Holy Spirit, it's the Sabbath. And that starts to unravel again. So there's a constant, so this group of people that we're just for the moment calling gospel Adventists, who remain and try and marry the two, I think are causing more cognitive dissonance and heartache and mental confusion for people than the actual really traditional fundamental Adventists, who you can just go, well, that's crazy, see you later. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a phenomenon that you don't usually find in any other denomination.
And you describe me, and so I have had to repent because I was part of exactly what you shared.
Me too, for 30 plus years.
And I didn't realize it, and literally until the last couple months that we've left, is, man, you verbalized that so powerfully, to my experience. I was trying to marry these things which are not reconcilable. I now believe, and those longtime hardcore conservative Adventists, acted against my preaching, that they couldn't counteract it from the Bible, but it didn't set well with them because it didn't have the legalese and the conservative element that which they're so passionate about. And those that did connect, it just created turmoil. I guess it makes a little more sense, even as we're talking, that I had never verbalized before, that I created this chaos absolutely out of ignorance, as I tried focusing on sharing the gospel with people who clearly didn't get it.
Yeah, we created it, we perpetuated it, we enabled people, we encouraged each other. I can imagine you and I, Terry, if we were doing ministry in the same town 20 years ago, we'd be going, look, how can we get Jesus to the young people and keep
Yeah.
away some of this cray from them and thinking we were doing good, but
Let's hide
actually
it.
we were the problem.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess,
Mhm.
what we're kind of both, uncovering in this conversation, the three of us, where these kind of dichotomies, and as I said, in other denominations, sure, you'll have problems and flaws and people doing terrible things and politics, and you'll even have people that are really conservative in how they live, and
Yeah.
people who are a bit more liberal in how they live. You'll have different theological kind of left and right, but you do not have people trying to marry two impossible things together. Wow, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I want to remember what time is it, because I'll make a little short on this later. What you guys have said has just really solidified some of my thoughts. Adventism has a group of people trying to marry two things together. Other denominations go, well, we don't agree with each other, so we're going to go to this slightly more liberal Baptist church, and we're going to go to this more conservative Baptist church. But they are never sitting there trying to convince each other that it can work. There are two kind of theologies in Adventism that
Wow,
are
that's good.
impossible to marry.
And they don't realize it. I never realized it. You didn't realize it. You have to get out of the forest to look back and now see that those two are incompatible, and core Adventist theology and the pure gospel are not compatible, because the system of rules and regulations is not the gospel. Go ahead, dear. You've been quiet here. I've been talking too
Carrie,
much.
jump in anytime. And
What bothered me for a long time was the yes buts of Adventism. Yes, you are saved because Jesus died for you, but here's a list of the rules that you have to follow in order to hang on to that. And that was, it just bothered you because it's like, yeah, Jesus, we're saved by grace. We believe that, but you can't do this, you can't do that. You got to go to, Saturday is the Sabbath. Can't eat this, can't wear that, can't wear jewelry. I mean, all these kind of silly, some people don't find them silly, but when you're,
and they're not only, and they're not only just do's and don'ts. Like every other denomination will have do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
But these are do's and don'ts that affect your salvation.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas other churches have do's and don'ts that are going to make your life better or not better, or you're cohesive, you won't get on as a community or whatever. But Adventism's do's and don'ts come with a huge amount of judgment. And like you said, Carrie, earlier, you found your baptismal vows. I'd love you to send me a copy of that. It's so hard to find them online. The Adventist Church like to kind of keep those little vows less accessible.
And Rochelle Anonymous had asked for a copy of that too, so I will take photos of it and send it to you in Facebook Messenger, and you can forward those on to her. Yeah.
Just a little aside here. Mark Anthony says, Peter, I'd like to change SDA&A. What are the chances? Let me know what you mean
it's
by
perfect
that.
The way it is. I don't know what his problem is.
Go for it. And this guy, I think I've heard from Darkness to Light before. I've heard you all talking about SDA message being anti-gospel, but I've not heard you all actually speaking to what the gospel is. What's up with that? So from Darkness to Light, obviously you've watched none of my content. Yes, this is a program that shines a light on all areas of Adventism. It's a former Adventist looking in from the outside is the subtitle of the show. And so we are scrutinizing big Adventist claims, but we're just about to hit 27 weeks in a row where we have a gospel hour once a week. And join us this week, Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific time, California time, from Darkness to Light, and you will hear us talking about what the gospel is. And I would suggest that in almost every single program, those who are speaking and shining a light and saying, come on, Adventism, we're going to scrutinize the truth. Is that okay? Because anyone that says you cannot scrutinize truth a truth claim. Whoa, that's you got some
Yeah.
problems there. So I encourage you to maybe watch more than a 5-minute soundbite of what we do, and you will see that people actually do share what the gospel is to them on most shows. And I'm sure we'll come to that a little bit later today. So, Carrie, I want you to share a little bit on some of your thoughts of when you first started. What age were you, and what were the thoughts when you first started doubting some of Ellen White's messages and content? Were you a kind of a true, because this is the thing, we the elephant in the room, we've chatted for over an hour, we haven't really talked about Ellen White too much, but we've mentioned that she is there whispering in all the content of Adventism. Even beyond the grave, she whispers to all Adventists in some way. So what was your experience with her as a young girl, and when did you first start having some doubts?
I think there was always just a little niggling, like, I honestly didn't like her. I'm not sure anybody really says they like, especially as a young woman growing up, like she took all the fun out of life, really. I mean, there was so much judgment of what to say and do. We grew up, we weren't strictly vegetarian. So that was a little shocking to some of my classmates in the little elementary school. I remember my mom would make us turkey sandwiches from leftover Thanksgiving dinner, and I'd eat the turkey, and one of my friends, he's like, "You're going to live 7 less years because you're eating meat." Like, whatever, dude. Like it didn't, but I don't think I ever really addressed the big picture of Ellen White until recently. As far as, she was there, but one thing that struck me is I've always been pretty active in Pathfinders, and I tried multiple times to start my master guide and to finish it and get invested as a master guide. And I don't know if you're familiar with the curriculum of master guide, Peter, but it's basically reading a lot of Ellen White books and typing up stuff about the 28 fundamentals. I never could get the reading done. I just couldn't get into it. I couldn't focus on her. But as I started doing my searching of when COVID hit, church kind of slowed down. I don't know if I'm really getting ahead of our story, but we can.
That's it. We can jump back and forward. That's all right.
Yeah. So after Terry had left denominational employment, we were just church members. COVID hit, some church politics, church hurt stuff happened. We were kind of pulling away from the church anyway, more from a social perspective than a doctrinal perspective at first. And so sitting at home, I love to watch documentaries on things, cult documentaries, weird religion stuff. So I found the series on Scientology by Leah Remini. Long story short, it's an awesome one. But there was just some mention in how their key leader, what he said still stuck for years and years. And it's just starting to click in my head, this ringing in the back of my head, like, this sounds really familiar, that we have a writer who is now passed away, but the writings are still vowed it's doctrine. It's how they live their lives. And it was mentioned in one of the interviews about cults. And I'm saying high demand religion more for Adventism.
Yeah.
But a police detective was listing off different religions that had been problematic in her investigative history. And Scientology, of course, was one. Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, some of the fundamental Baptist type stuff. And she mentioned Seventh-day Adventist. I'm like, oh. So I'm just like, what? So I started Googling, started doing a little bit of research, started watching stuff on YouTube. The Christian Scholars Forum, I got onto them. I saw an interview with Steve Daly, I think that they did, bought his book, read the psychobiography, and reading that basically put her, in my mind, out of the picture.
Yeah.
Like, she is no longer a part of where I'm going to base my doctrine. And then I'm looking, what does the Adventist church have that's different from all of these other beautiful Christian people out there? It's Ellen White.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting, the when you mentioned Steve Daly, and I've had him on the show at least 3 times, and he is very challenging, and he does speculate as well, which it's fine. I mean, Adventists speculate all the time. All Adventist apologists, they live in speculation land, and he speculates and pulls information together that's pretty damning evidence, but he was one of the first ones that I've read in many, many, many years. Apart from our good friend Walter Ray and the White Lie, that actually says she was false prophet and she knew what she was doing and she was scamming people. A lot of us like to go, oh no, she was a lovely person and maybe deluded, but he really put on the table some food for me to kind of taste and go, oh, hang on a second, maybe she's a scam artist. Maybe she's the same as Joseph Smith, who was just full on, power building, money making, storytelling. And that's a hard pill to swallow. So have you kind of been pondering those things, Carrie?
Oh, yeah.
Where did you land on that she is a scam artist, that she's false prophet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty sure. I mean, we have, we just got this one whitewashed.
Yes. Now, did you
I've
get a chance?
Halfway through it.
Oh, good. That's what Rochelle Anonymous and our book club are reading at the moment.
Yeah.
Isn't it an amazing book?
It's good.
My experience with Ellen White was, as a kid, I was talked a lot about her in church and told that she was a true prophet. And I remember I mentioned that girl that I dated right after high school that was influential, that kind of showed me the gospel. I remember continuing to push on Adventist teachings early on, and then I remember mentioning Ellen White, but there's the prophet that was just kind of the trump card, and it was one of these experiences that I can't explain. She almost lost control, and she said, "Terry, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. No, she's not. That's not true."
Wow.
And she stopped and she said, "Terry, that wasn't me. I don't know what happened." And we immediately started praying, because it was almost like she said she became possessed. And it was at that point where I said, whoa. It was, for someone who, I had utmost respect for her faith. She's like, "Terry, that is not of God. I don't know anything about it, but as you keep mentioning her, that is not in line with the Bible." And so that was a key experience moment. I still remember it vividly, like it was yesterday.
Almost a divine, not demonic message.
Yeah, I think so. So at that moment,
Wow.
I remember, okay, I need to set her aside, and I have no problem going Bible and Bible only. That being said, as I got into seminary, Ellen White class after Ellen White class,
and getting reeled back.
And I got reeled back in, but I never forgot that in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And so while I was taught, Ellen White this, Ellen White that in the seminary, and of course, prove that she's a prophet, I still had that in the back of my mind. I got to be cautious with this, and let's stand on the Bible and the Bible only. But of course, as an Adventist, I would use her in my sermons, and I would fall back into that trap and kind of reel in, because Adventism does that. But there's always things going through seminary. they did a good job of using apologetics for Ellen White. You read all the quotes that you can read on the internet about amalgamation of man and beast,
Yeah.
and you could run through all of them. So in seminary we talked about those and explained those away because they prepared us to
Insulate you.
insulate us
Yeah.
and respond to critics. But I still was tied into her, but it was probably 2 years ago. Carrie had read Daly's book, Psychobiography, a year before I did, and she would ask me about some of the things, and I had some of the answers I heard, and some of the stuff didn't bother me. But when I finally, about a year later, said, okay, I'll read this and stuff, his portrayal, and he shared several things I had not heard before, it finally kind of pushed me over the edge. Is like, wow, there was more here that I was deceived of. And there's things here you just cannot match up anymore, that there's too many inconsistencies. Is everything she wrote bad and evil?
No.
I'm not saying it was, but is there error mixed in here, which is irreconcilable, especially if the Adventist claims that she is the inspired word of God, the spirit of prophecy.
And what you try to do there is, and I've been having an interesting conversation with Stephen Beagles, who has a website called Gospel Adventism, and he's trying to set up an independent ministry that is all these gems of Adventism in one kind of place. He's not starting a movement, but a kind of a collective, I guess. He's one of the few liberal, progressive, revisionist, gospel, Big Ten Adventists that actually wants to shout this gospel gem from the rooftops. Most are too scared to, because they'll lose their jobs. But it's interesting. He and I were discussing recently that if you don't put Ellen White on the pedestal of prophet, but you also put her higher than C.S. Lewis as an inspirational writer, you're creating a new category. And I said to him, and I've said this to others in the last few days, that well, who else is in that category since 1844? Because they're trying to claim that she's not super special, but she's more special than C.S. Lewis, but less special than the prophets of the Bible. And he couldn't think of anyone. So again, whatever way you slice it, you're creating a special category for Ellen G. White.
Yeah.
Now you've got a really good comment here. It's great to have Miles Christian watching. Hey, Miles, go and check out his incredible channel. An honest SDA pastor, praise God. But to be honest, you leave the church because something you've said there, both of you kind of had seeds for this stuff planted in your late teens, maybe early 20s, but you kept being pulled back in. Let's make it work. Let's marry the two together. We can do it. And so you spend this kind of, you pretty much, you're the good years God has given you have been spent. Let's marry it. Let's make it work. Let's try and make it work. And I've read that, and it feels true in my life, that it takes 25 to 30 years to de-brainwash yourself from cultish kind of indoctrination. And I'm guessing the seeds were
23 more years
planted.
to go, honey.
And I'm guessing the seeds were planted for you guys in your early 20s, and you look like you're in your mid to late 40s now. Is that roughly right?
That's correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you're proving my theory and the theory of others correct, that it took 25 years. There's a pastor watching today. I won't mention his name, but he influenced me greatly when I was 22, and I'm 62 now, and that's 40 years. I've seen him doing incredible work within the Adventist church. A pastor, he's retired now, obviously, and I love him to death, and he's watching now, but he's defending and still trying to marry the two together, even though I've heard him say, interviewing him on my program, that you can't even really call the Seventh Adventist Church a Protestant church because of its faulty beliefs. But he is still marrying the two together. And you, Carrie, Terry, me, many watching, gave this church the best years of our lives. I left when I was like 54, gave it the best years of our lives, trying to marry it all together. And the reality is right under our noses is an anti-gospel. Imagine, and people say, oh, don't, and I don't regret anything, honestly, but I refuse to say, oh, but I'm the person I am now because of what I've been through. No, I was robbed. I was robbed of the best
Wow.
years of my life. I'm not saying I would have achieved more. It's not a
Yeah.
competition. It's not like, oh, I would have been richer, more famous, more powerful, more. I'm not saying any of that. But I was robbed of having a pure, gospel-centered, simple life. I don't want a big life, a better life, a more ordained life. But I am not a better person now as some kind of, life just unfolds for a reason. Yes, I am a better person now because I've worked through stuff. I've thought about stuff. I've tried to be a better person. I've let go of striving. I just enjoy waking up and feeling the breeze on my face and having a nice cafe at the local restaurant. But my point is, I think it's important to actually be able to say we were hoodwinked. We had the wool pulled over our eyes, and whatever way you slice it, that's a sad event.
The heart of, I just want to echo that, even though I had that gospel experience, the Adventism, the legalism, I still would have these doubts because I didn't have assurance of my salvation, even as an Adventist pastor. I loved Jesus. I believed I was doing my best, but there was always, am I doing enough? Man, I had this thought. I did this on the Sabbath. Oh, I had this to eat, or I had a diet Mountain Dew, or a soda with caffeine. I've never been a coffee drinker. So I was a good Adventist. I didn't drink coffee. I didn't like coffee, but I had my diet Coca-Cola.
I got mine right here.
Yeah.
And just this nagging thing in the back of my mind was robbing my joy that I should have had.
Yeah.
And it was this unnecessary burden and a different gospel.
Yeah. And look, I guarantee when you approach 50, 60, every single human on the planet is going to look back and go, oh, I was robbed of this, or my parents did that. I'm not talking about that normal human kind of experience where we've all had people pressure us, suppress us, hurt our feelings, done terrible things. I'm not talking about those normal things. I'm talking about a deep thread of a unique perspective, a prequel to the Bible, a paraphrase of the Bible, what happens after the Bible, what happens in the future, what happens in the heavens. We have had this incredible indoctrination that is almost like a cult. And people who have been through that, in addition to normal life's robbing, have to, you almost struggle even becoming a mature human being because something is robbed within you. You've been suppressed so long. You've had the Stockholm syndrome where you've loved the church in spite of it abusing you. There are some pretty big identity issues you have to face along with the normal things of life. And I'm not being Mr. Victim. I go to sleep happy every night. I really love my life. You cannot imagine how much I love my life. It's amazing. The last few years have just been incredible. But I left the church. It'll be coming up 9 years next month. And I've had to do a whole lot of pretty intense, serious work to manage coming to where I am right now. And I'm lucky. I haven't had depression. I've always been a laid back kind of guy. So imagine if you've got some mental health issues, imagine if you've got other kind of issues you're dealing with. One of the reasons I was so pleased that you guys came on today is there are people watching who are going through this identity loss. Where do I go now? What can I do? Who am I? We need to hear our stories to say you're not alone. A lot of us feel this way. Let's gather together.
It's a process of deconstruction really, and you there's kind of a buzzword out there a lot with people who've left religion or whatever, they're deconstructing their faith. For us, imagine a house that's built and every other brick is faulty. You can't just knock those bricks out and replace them. You got to tear the whole thing down
Yeah.
and build it back up again.
Yeah.
And that is a painful, long process.
Yeah.
And I know personally, I'm not there yet. There's a lot of stuff I'm still trying to figure out, but I know Jesus died for my sins, and that's the most important thing at this point. I'll work on figuring out the rest later, but it's a slow process.
You raise a good point though, Carrie. When you become an adult and you face your normal rebuilding of, oh wow, I didn't realize, that happened to me at school, or I was bullied, or this happened, or whatever, you can repair part of the house of the rebuilding and on your journey to maturity, or you can live with parts of the house not being built. But you have an overall shelter that you can work with. With something like Adventism, with these high, you used the word that
high demand religion.
High demand that Andy Mack has mentioned several times as well.
Yeah.
Mormonism, JWs, Seventh-day Adventism, these high demand religions require a complete deconstruction and then a complete rebuild. And it's not easy. And I guess we're just saying that, hey, hang in there, those of you that are watching, and those of you that have decided to stay Adventist and work within that framework. That's great. I'm glad for your mental health and your ability to do that and grow up and be mature. That's awesome. But for some of us, it has hit us like a hurricane and it destroyed our house. And I'm like you, Carrie. I am nowhere near rebuilt in the sense of being perhaps a complete, but I've found sanctuary and solace in some of the core stuff that I know to be true. And so you can find that and you can be happy and you can go to sleep at night happy. But it's not easy. And so I guess the three of us are standing here as testament to, those of you that are struggling, those of you that are on the fringe or hurting or questioning or have left the church and having struggles. We're here for you, even if it's just this conversation for you to listen to. I think it's important that there be some kind of a ministry like Former Adventist Fellowship, where you can go, and I think what I'm trying to do is not, like, I love Former Adventist Fellowship, what they're doing, and what they're doing is providing an alternative place of worship almost, whereas I'm trying to create I don't want to judge anyone's journey or where they're going or what they believe or don't believe. I'm not saying I have an answer that they can join, but we're just at least a what do you call those, a haven for a while to gather to get yourself back up and moving again.
Part of what has been so healing for us is finding a genuine community of Christians who love Jesus first. And we have found that as we've left Adventism in these other churches, we have found some of the nicest, most sincere Christians we've ever met. And sadly, we never experienced that in Adventism our whole lives. And in 20 years of ministry, most of the relationships ultimately were superficial. You're living with this sense of needing to be perfect, not being vulnerable because you really don't want someone to know that you're struggling with these things. And so as a pastor, I think I was a pretty vulnerable person, but man, that was not reciprocated by the membership at all. When we finally left, we started a non-denominational Bible study. We still have a Bible study at our house on Wednesday nights with about 25 people studying Romans right now. It's awesome. We've studied Galatians. We've been studying Hebrews, and I remember we started this group, and as we were getting to know them and they were getting to know us, at one point I was so fearful to share that I was a previous Seventh-day Adventist pastor because what their thoughts would be or stuff like that, and they're like, "Hey, okay."
Be fine with it. Yeah,
they don't care.
They don't care.
I think we're so brainwashed growing up in Adventism because we think so negatively of the Sunday keepers. That they're going to think negatively of us.
That's
They
right.
don't. They
No,
don't care. They don't know who an Adventist is really. And
no.
to explain some of the beliefs, and when I showed my baptismal certificate to some of the ladies in my Bible study last night, they're like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
But they're not judging. They're a safe place, and so we're attending a large non-denominational church, and it's so refreshing to be able to be vulnerable and to
Mm,
express your questions, because Adventism doesn't welcome questions,
no.
especially if you're a new believer. It makes sense if you're questioning, but if you grew up in it, you should have it figured out.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. That's interesting.
So the relationship aspect has been so critical for us in our healing and our continued healing. I would say we have the best friends we've ever had in our life in a Christian community, which it took us sadly leaving Adventism behind, and we didn't find. And I'm sure others have a different experience. That there's good people in Adventism,
Yeah.
um, but there is something I've come to believe in the theology and culture which doesn't allow true Christian unity and true Christian vulnerability and relationships as God intended it to be.
Yeah.
That verse, I preached about the verse in John 13, by this all men will know you are my disciples if you love one another. Love others as I have loved you. I paraphrasing that, but I preached on that, and it just always hit a brick wall when I preached that in my Adventist churches. And that was so important to me, but I felt like I was the only one, and my wife began to get that after she heard me preach dozens of sermons on that topic, but that just doesn't preach well in Adventism.
No. No. No.
Unfortunately, and the rest of the Christian community, again, there's always exceptions, but people love Jesus and they're living for him, and they're generally loving people. I have run into so many mean Adventists.
Yeah.
And there's good Adventists again, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, as I look back on my years of pastoral experience in multiple states and multiple churches, these themes of the legalistic, the focus. I remember talking with an Adventist colleague, pastor friend of mine, and he had someone come to him, true story, and just say, I have a question for you. And my pastor friend, was in his mid 20s, relatively new in ministry. This person was in his mid 70s. And he said, I have perfected every area of my life. My diet is perfect. I'm stewardship and everything. But one thing, I want you to help me with this. And my Adventist pastor friend was taken back. And what could I help you with? He said, I perfected every area in my life except one. I don't know how to love people.
Yeah.
That's a true story, but talk
Wow.
about missing
The whole point.
the whole point
Yeah.
of the gospel. And sadly, that reflects much of my experience in the church with other people. You're focused on keeping the Sabbath on your diet, and you totally miss loving other people. That's how people know you are a follower of Jesus. If you love, not what your diet is, not what day you worship on, do you love as Jesus loved?
Yeah.
And the rest, much of the evangelical Christian community gets that and is living that out.
Yeah.
And Adventism misses that with its core theology. Ellen White, I think, missed that, as Daly's book points out. She was a pretty ruthless person in many documented situations. And so, yikes! I'll be quiet.
No, it's the whole thrust of Jesus' message is to love one another. And
Like I used to be a preacher or something, Pete.
yeah, I love it. I'm loving this conversation. You mentioned your home group, and it's in our Thursday 6 p.m. I'd love you guys to join and contribute, but in Australia it's 1 p.m. Friday, and California is 6 p.m. Thursday. But we had Emma Ray did 2 programs on Galatians. Frank Marandino just finished 3 on Galatians, and Emma Ray just did 1 on Romans. She's doing another one on Romans this week. Frank's going to do another one next week. We've got about 12 different presenters. Would love both of you to come and share a program. We've got other couples that come and share as well, and they just take a presentation like a sermon. Terry, you're about to just preach again to an audience. Yeah, you're about to preach again to an audience that just is hungry for this gospel, the gospel minus the Adventist filter. And Frank Marandino said something so powerful the other week. Friday before last, Thursday before last. He said that what reveals Jesus to the world is not people looking in and seeing how well behaved the Christians are, but seeing a community grow in love.
Amen.
And that is the revelation of Christ's word, that a community that grows. It's not perfect. It makes mistakes. It admits that it's vulnerable. It confesses that, wow, there's all these things I do wrong. But for those looking in, they see a community reflecting love. And I thought it's so powerful, because even though there's many Adventists trying to marry it and make it work and find the gospel within it, its core DNA, doctrinal, official teachings are not that.
They are not.
So sure, if that's not your Adventism, great, wish you well, but you don't have to scratch too far beneath the surface to find legalism coursing through every vein in the Adventist body. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying there is just so true, that if you can't kind of, and it sounds like a cliche, but if you can't focus on this loving aspect of loving one another, and you find that hard to do, and you're constantly judging or assessing or placing your ego in all sorts of incorrect situations, it's not a reflection of true divine connection.
No.
So we chatted there with Carrie earlier about her early Ellen White experiences. What about you, Terry? What were some of your thoughts early on, and when did you start to see if some of these, we've talked about the Steve Daly kind of stuff. When did you start to have some questions about her?
There was, as I mentioned, that early experience, there was always a little bit of disconnect. So I always was cautious, but, there's statements which are very powerful in the Desire of Ages and Steps to Christ, that you could look at it. And so I tried to kind of pick and choose and could find enough little bits here to kind of keep me engaged with her. I guess somehow, probably through dialogue with other colleagues, I came to a point where I was more comfortable with her completed works and pretty much dismissed her letters and even testimonies as more fringe. And so I tried to pick and choose, and so I from a traditional evidence perspective, I was off base, but I tried to find value where I thought I could find value and justify, trying to make it work, especially as the Adventist pastor. I kind of had to, because that's what I signed up for. And looking back now, I just shake my head and ask for forgiveness, because again, it was kind of mixing truth with error. I didn't realize it at the time. It's only since leaving the church. It's been about 6.5 years ago that I chose to leave full-time denomination, as I just became more disenfranchised with the legalism and the politics in the system. And it just kind of kept rearing its ugly head. And after 20 years of faithful denominational service, had an opportunity to leave and I was hired by one of my previous members who I currently work at a large wholesale landscape nursery. I grow trees, 1,000 acres of nursery trees. And
Wow.
my owner is a Seventh-day Adventist. He used to be one of my elders that I pastored. And so at that time, we were still Seventh-day Adventists. But, moved back here, and the church had no idea what to do with me as a previous pastor. Even the denomination in the state, it was a total disconnect. And we were almost shunned because I'd left denominational employees. Like, there must be something wrong with you.
Yeah.
You
And
must have done something bad.
yeah, I must have done something. I didn't. I got
He
burned.
did not.
I got burned out as well.
Yeah.
I put my whole heart and soul. You mentioned some of the best years of my life.
Yeah.
I was absolutely workaholic. I'm working for the Lord, and so
Yeah.
I can work 80 hours a week. And man, I don't spend enough time with my family and my young kids. And so
Yeah.
when I left, I thought I had a chance to spend more time with my kids, and I did. But since leaving full-time pastoral ministry and denominational work, really struggled to find my place in the church, and there was just this growing disconnect that happened, and growing disconnect with Ellen White too, and kind of back to just biblical foundations. Because I just realized that the Bible had to stand alone, which I taught as an Adventist, which Adventists teach.
Say that.
They say that. And
Yeah.
so
They
I'm
don't
like,
mean it,
I'm going to believe that. And so I'm not going to go wrong by not reading Ellen White, by just reading the Bible. But she still was in the back of my mind, because that's what Adventism is. And you're just so brainwashed is a strong term, but I don't think it's an accurate term.
No.
So it was a process. I had my questions, but it was the disconnect of things, and we could get into a lot more of some personal experiences that were key to kind of pushing us to look at other options, and just seeing where God is not in what's happening in structure in the church that we were a part of, in dynamics and relationships, how we were treated. It was just so wrong and sinful,
From local church, pastor level, conference leadership level, just wasn't done well and wasn't done right.
Biblically.
Wasn't done biblically. So we won't go into specifics, but it was enough to make us go, you know what? I think we might find another place to worship for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was a struggle to find a place. And luckily there was a couple places that had the Saturday afternoon and evening services, so we can just kind of, ease away.
I didn't answer your question, Peter. I went off on my own tangent. You kind of asked about Ellen White. I don't know.
I'm interested in so for me, just to give you an example, and I'm interested in both your thoughts on this. I had that inkling, things I didn't like about her, stuff that scared the willies out of me when I'd read Great Controversy, Time of Trouble, Close of Probation, Running to the Hills, finding a cave somewhere, Sabbath afternoon walks. I had all of that stuff, nightmares, would I be saved? What if my probation's closed right now? But I had very liberal, progressive parents. I had none of that. I was chatting to them about this the other night. I said, nothing you guys ever said to me. They just didn't talk about that stuff. They didn't go into that stuff. They only talked about Jesus and the Bible and positive stuff. I never had any of this from my parents, but it was always Sabbath school or at school or listening to the pastor at church. So I had all these things like you guys say, but it wasn't until I was 22, I think it was, and I was giving Bible studies to a guy. And I was just a lay person. I was a school teacher and a musician. That was my passion, playing music to share my love of Jesus on the weekends, and teaching special ed during the week. But so I was giving this guy a Bible study, and I had 2 or 3 actually. We'd have it on Tuesday nights, and I'd offer them a free vegetarian meal, and they'd come around and we'd talk about the Bible. And this guy said to me, well, Ellen White talks about stuff that's not even in the Bible. And I said, oh, no, everything's based on the Bible, or she's doing an interpretation of something in the Bible. And he said, well, what about that part where she's her angel shows her this in vision, Satan seeing an angel walk past and saying, look, I need to talk to God and Jesus, and he ushers him in, and he says, and I've got the text, the quote everywhere. This is so true, that she says this, and Satan asks for forgiveness. And God says, no, it's too late now. You can't be forgiven. Well, that is so not biblical. That's extra biblical thing. So here I am, 22. This kind of thing I'm wondering has happened to you guys, where I suddenly went, hang on a second. This is an actual concrete bit of evidence that she didn't say, that the Bible doesn't say that, and she's adding to the narrative. And then I went back to trying to make it work and marry it by saying, well, she was just creative and had artistic license, and it makes it more interesting. But actually, at a theological level, it's profoundly unbiblical. I guess that's what I'm asking. Did you both come across those moments where you suddenly went, whoa, hang on a second, at a young age, not as you're older reading Steve Daly's stuff, but where the moments when, hang on, she copied from people? Fanny Bolton, what's this about her? That kind of thing.
I never really heard anything about the plagiarism growing up. Nothing. Because I was in such an insulated Adventist bubble that didn't happen. And when I did interact with people who were not members of the Adventist church, they didn't know anything about Ellen White or Adventism. So it wasn't anything they'd bring up. I do remember as a kid, though, believing that because she had only been educated up to 3rd grade, but she was now able to write such beautiful work, like The Desire of Ages. What a glorious work of literature, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm reading Steve Daly's book, and he's like, she had secretaries and bookmakers that did all of her editing. And I'm like, that honestly really made me mad.
Yeah.
Because here I was as a kid who I read all the time, so I could appreciate good, like, she's an awesome writer.
Yeah.
But I was deceived to where she didn't write it.
No, like
she had a couple of secretaries, one of which I think she sent to an asylum because she went like
Fanny
crazy
Bolton.
making. I told you.
Yeah. And like the Ellen White house just down the road here, where she lived here for nearly 10 years. In literally, I could be there in 5 minutes walking. Marion Davis was her secretary, and she wrote Desire of Ages pretty much in her time here. And Marion, I wish she wrote some of her own books, because she's just a master writer. You read Desire of Ages, and just some of it is so beautifully written. But it's all Ellen didn't write any books. Like even the books that are supposed to be books are just her gathering together a bunch of her night written notes and scribblings and hands them over to Marion or Fanny. And then they, in the early days, not even aware that a lot of the writings were direct taken from other authors. They then just paraphrase it and make it beautiful, and Ellen goes, yeah, good, that's generally what I'm trying to say, and out it goes. These kind of things, like the church in the 80s funded Fred Veltman. I don't know if you've read any of that at all. We've got at least 2 or 3 shows here on it. They paid Fred 8 years to study the Desire of Ages, and he came out with incredibly damning evidence of her paraphrasing, and they just pushed it under the covers, under the carpet. And in the 90s, when I started getting into this sort of stuff to start with, reading The White Lie and reading Ron Number's book, The Prophetess of Health, which was a bit more palatable, I was blown away that people didn't know about this. And here we are now, for the first time in Adventist history, the first time in history, where they cannot hide it anymore. They're trying their best. And, Miles is watching now, and I heard someone else mention Thunder. These guys and myself get a huge amount of ad hominem attack. They're attacking our character, not our content. But they cannot hide it anymore. And there are people every week I'm getting messages from people saying, wow, we knew nothing about this. Well, that's because before they could control it. So it's quite believable that you both didn't really come across this stuff until recently.
And even in, like I said, in seminary, we studied her, and they put together the curriculum in such a way where they brought all these up. So when I started seminary, one of the first classes you're required to take, your first quarter semester there, is Revelation and Inspiration.
Yeah.
So in there, that they're laying the foundation for Ellen White, and they're laying the foundation for copying and plagiarism. How is an author inspired? Well, Paul, he quotes the Old Testament, and he doesn't give it, give a reference when he's quoting that. Oh, and Ellen White, she quotes other authors, and she doesn't give credit, just like Paul did.
Yes.
And so,
and plagiarism wasn't illegal back then.
Well, and all the stuff they copied was just word of mouth stories that were known anyway.
Exactly,
but they weren't even copying. There was never like here's plagiarism, passing off material as your own work. Whenever they did it, there was common knowledge that they're sharing. They're going into the story about the three little pigs or the Goldilocks. People knew these stories were being passed on. It was out of
copyright by then.
And it wasn't even a copyright issue. Hers distinctly, the term in the Webster's or whatever, the Oxford Dictionary, back in her day for plagiarism is identical to what it is today almost. It was borrowing and using other people's material and passing it off as your own. Yes, they had some copyright stuff with publishing. You could publish a book that was released in Europe, in the USA, and they couldn't do anything about it. But there's ethics involved as well.
The Sketches from the Life of Paul book, I have the facsimile copy that was issued in the 1970s or 80s.
Wow.
But that book was pulled off out of the market because the original author's like, hang on, you don't get to publish that. So the Adventist pulled it away, and now it says, there was some issue with whatever. And then they basically made a facsimile copy, and I have a copy of that. And there's some weird little thing to explain why they pulled it off the market, which,
Hang on to that stuff, because I'm now talking to Adventist apologists that say the Connie Bear Howson thing, which is the issue you're talking about. Connie Bear and Howson were publishers, and they said, you've just copied our book almost word for word, including pictures and including the headings of each chapter. Mm-hmm. This is more than just following the thread of Paul, therefore there being similarities. And so, as you say, they took it off. But the Adventist apologists now are saying, no, that's just a myth. That's never happened. And they're removing information off the internet. So hang on to anything you've got. They're trying to rewrite history.
Yeah, I was naive enough as I was, going into seminary, believing in the church, the mission of the church. Well, I had questions, was told that, of course, Satan, wherever there's truth, Satan's going to attack. And so, even though these things are out there, they're overblown and they're really not factual. And so the church had done a pretty good job for a long time of covering all these things up. So when my wife read Daly's book, I said, I've heard that before in seminary. That really doesn't bother me because, here's the explanation for this. Here's the explanation for that. And even though I had some questions, I just kind of went along with the deception, because there's no way that the church could pull the wool over my eyes and everyone else's eyes for this long. And come to find out, I guess they could.
They could, and they did.
And it's that was, it is shocking, and as I continue to read, and again, you've mentioned Miles several times, and Jim Baber and different things. Those guys have been very helpful to me. Shout out to them, and their ministries and their work has been processing and coming out, the information that they're sharing,
and Miles and Jim both come across pretty harsh when you watch the videos. So if you're newly kind of questioning,
Yeah.
is not comfortable to listen to.
No.
It's not like Peter, I found your channel much more comforting at first and able to make me start thinking and more of, and kind of questioning stuff. And then I was more willing to listen to Miles and to Jim.
Yeah,
Because
I'm the gateway drug to those guys.
What's that?
I'm the gateway drug to those guys.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And embrace it. It's
Well,
we all need the gateway.
I love it because when I first
we love you, Miles and Jim. Nothing personal.
they don't mind at all because they get to be the main drug.
That's right.
When I read the cover's fallen off my actual copy, but when I first read this, it was about 1985. I think it came out in 84. So I was just a young guy. I could not cope. This was the version of Miles, Christian, and Baber and these guys back then. I could not cope. And so I put it on a high shelf. And then in the early 90s, so, 10, 12 years later, at my parents' place, I came across the Ron Numbers book, Prophetess of Health. And I began reading that in about 1992, 93. And that blew my mind. If anyone wants to really, I love Whitewashed, I love White Out. Rochelle and I are going to have book club again, hopefully next week after, as we explore these books. They are incredible books. But if you really want to go to an incredible, factual, historical, focused Ellen White kind of book, go to Ron Numbers' Prophetess of Health, because you can read it and it's like, and reading that, when I then later came to do this, I thought I want to go that kind of way where we can just shine a light on all these things to encourage people to go and explore more deeply. And Miles has been on the show a few times, and so I bring the foxes into the hen as well.
I see he put a comment on there. He said, "I'm a firebrand."
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Yep.
A pastor.
You got to get eased into it, though.
A pastor called me a very interesting term. I'm not going to say it, because if I ever hear people say that this is what I'm doing, I'll know he was sharing. He said it to me privately, but yeah, one day I'll say what the term is, because it's very accurate.
And Test the Prophet, shout out to him too.
Oh, my goodness.
His stuff. I know he's got some more stuff coming. I keep hearing rumblings, but I haven't. But if you haven't seen it, it's because he'll take the original source and then he'll take the original publishing of Ellen White and compare the sentences. And it's just, and you can't argue with it. It's right there in black and white, that there's so much. I need to watch him again, because it's been probably a year and a half or more since I watched his stuff, but so good.
I highly recommend Test the Prophet. It's on YouTube. Everybody watching, go and find Test the Prophet. It's just incredible stuff. And also, John Borton is a guy I've interviewed, and he's written a book, and he and I together have made it available as an audio book. It's probably the most damning book I've ever read. It's short. He reads it. But we had problems with getting it on all the tech stuff, so we're going to try again soon. I'll let everyone know when that's available.
Mm-hmm.
But
Christian
a lot of
was good too.
Yeah, a lot. Oh yes, the Brenners.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah,
that was the big thing. When things aren't making sense, it's a reason. There's a reason.
Yeah. There's so much stuff, and all of the people that are putting out the content, we love supporting each other's work as well. And there's some amazing guests that have been on the show recently that are just, and if you get a chance, watch the Des Ford stuff coming out. That the one I did last week with looking back at the Bill Johnson it's a mind-blowing, the revelations that these guys share when they're now retired, when
they can speak freely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep. And it's the John Ankerberg show from the 80s when that came out with Martin.
Yes. Oh,
Kingdom of the Cults with Bill Johnson was on that one as well, right? And
yes.
that was
The
that was
1984 John Ankerberg,
yeah.
Dr. Bill Johnson and he and I discussed it in my interview, but it is mind-blowing stuff. Yeah, mind-blowing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And look, this is the thing. This kind of information now is out there, and I encourage people to just go and have a look. Just go and, even if it makes you feel uncomfortable, try and resist the idea of attacking the people that are sharing it. And
Yes.
just go, okay, well, why do I feel uncomfortable? Why do I hate Pete now because of this stuff? Ask yourself why you're feeling what you're feeling, and
Yeah.
just explore it. Just go in. And
Mhm.
if it's truth, you've got nothing to fear. Absolutely nothing to fear.
You absolutely owe it to yourself. I can say from my experience, our experience, as we get a little distance looking back, when you're in it, you get so caught up that you cannot see objectively, because I've been there, and I think we've all been there. But from someone who was raised in the system and then worked for the system, again, worked in 3 conferences in the Midwest, and pastored in multiple churches, multiple conference systems, multiple conference presidents, working in education. I did full-time pastoral ministry for 15 years, and then kind of began moving into an administration route. And I spent 5 years in academy administration. And the things that I've seen and experienced there, just are some of them are mind blowing when we look back and you just say God wasn't part of this. It just is against all this. So you got the theology, and then you've got the practice on the inside, where it just is not following and living Christian principles, not even pretending to at times. And so not only do you have the core theology that the church tries to make tries to have good appearance to the outside world, but having been inside of that, again, not all bad, not all evil, but that's looking back, that was where I really began disconnecting from the church, and just saying just the things that we've seen and experienced as well. So which again, when the core theology is off, you expect the actions to be off as well, but it just, none of it lines up. And if people are watching who there's a reason that you're watching, and as you said, Peter, truth stands up to scrutiny and examination. And so if you have questions, keep digging in. Start with Jesus. Somebody mentioned the gospel earlier. It all starts with Jesus. Living a sinless life, dying for our sins, giving us the offer to follow him as we turn to him and accept his righteous life for our sinful life.
And as you are now entering almost a new kind of phase of your lives, which I think no doubtedly is you're demonstrating that it's a ministry. You've got was it Monday or Tuesday night gathering? Wednesday, sorry. So you've got this gathering each week. I'm reading between the lines, but it sounds like you're just focusing on gospel-related gatherings. You may find that at some point people ask you to comment more, like today's program, on having been an Adventist and some of the things that you'd like to warn people about. So you may even have a whole other new thing that sort of begins to grow off on the side there as well. You will find that you'll get some pushback from people when you start doing that, but I think you can cope with that. But the interesting thing that you'll find, so I've interviewed 2 guys that are incredibly smart, and John Rosier is one, and he has written some stuff like what Adventism could have been. He is still an Adventist, but he has a church group there in England that is, so removed in many ways. They're like their own little church that is still officially an Adventist church. And another guy called Dr. Milton Hook, who wrote an interesting biography on Des Ford, easy to find, a great, fantastic book. Both of these guys at different points in interviews have said to me, so John said, not only does Adventism not have the gospel, it is anti-gospel. And Milton Hook in another interview said, not only does the church not understand Christ or have Christ, they are anti-Jesus, they are anti-Christ. Now, afterwards, whenever I've interviewed these two guys, the liberal progressive revisionist gospel Big Tent Adventists always write, oh, thanks, so good that you had John on today, and Milton's amazing. And they are. I love those guys. Super, super incredible humans, and do incredible work with their writing and whatnot. But what interests me is that if you're still in the church, you can say these incredibly kind of like for John Rosier to say, not only doesn't it have the gospel, it is anti-gospel, is a way worse than anything I think I've said. But I'm getting attacked every day for, oh, you're just hurt and bitter and you've got an axe to grind, and I'm like, man, that's nothing compared to what he said. So why do you think that is? Is it just simply because they are still Adventists, they get away with it? And B, have you had these thoughts? Say, we talked about Ellen White, and you both said, yeah, we don't think, yeah, she not only was she not just an inspirational person, we think she might have been a scam artist. Are you thinking that about the Adventist gospel? Not only is it not the gospel, that it is maybe anti-gospel. So two things there. What are your thoughts on why people who are Adventists can get away with saying some pretty damning things and write some pretty interesting books like Canaries and Ostriches, or Ostriches and Canaries, whatever. Why can they get away with that? And B, is Adventism anti-gospel?
Well, I think they can get away with it because you're more of a threat when you have left. I don't know if it's like they feel like you're stealing company secrets or something, or I don't think Adventism as a system knows what to do with somebody who, quote, knows the truth and decides to, from their perspective, turn their back on it and leave. But if you're still part of it, still put your name to it, you haven't really turned your back all the way. And so maybe there's still hope for you. I don't know.
Right.
I think there's so much pride associated with being an Adventist. I think a lot of it just comes down to pride, honestly.
The system protects itself at its core. There's a survivalistic thing in those that are paid by the church for their livelihood, the pastors, the administrators, and those who are part of the system. There's a little bit of a never used this term before, but a good old boys club.
Yes. Yeah.
And when people leave that, you're breaking your sacred oath, if you will.
Right.
So it was a really hard thing. It's been about a little over a year and a half ago when we officially asked to have our membership drop from the church. And it was a big step, crossing that barrier, and especially having been a pastor in this system for almost 2 decades, to just say, we see enough error here that we need to divorce ourselves from this system. But where those who are still part of it, as Carrie said, you can get away with saying things because you're still part of the matrix, if you will. There's a lot that goes on in the system that if you've never been part of the paid system, might surprise you, and not deep dark secrets, but it just is its own animal, if you will.
I think too, those that have Adventist pastors, if they don't want to be an Adventist pastor anymore, what do they do? What can they do? And fortunately, Terry has a bachelor's degree in horticulture business, and so he was able to find another career path. But many, if he would have had a bachelor's of theology and then gone to seminary, where's the job? I mean, maybe you could be a chaplain, but there's not a good backup plan. So I think a lot of pastors are trapped from a financial perspective. Is that right or wrong? But that's the way it is, I think, for a lot of them, is because they've got a family to feed and educate.
Yeah.
And
so that kind of and I've heard definitely over here, but I've heard in the States as well that SDA pastors are actually paid quite well. Certainly better than most of their counterparts in ministry.
I don't know if that's necessarily true here. From what I experienced, I wouldn't say it was paid very well.
There's a cost of living adjustment. So if you're living in LA, Los Angeles, you're gonna make a lot more money than if you live in the Midwest, because the cost of living, it's much cheaper to live here. So you're gonna make less money. So if you look at the numbers and maybe do an average of the salary, that may not be an accurate representation.
I think the study I read was not that they make a lot of money, but they make more than their other denominational counterparts. So an Adventist minister in the Midwest will earn more than a Baptist minister.
And a lot of those Baptist ministers may be bivocational as well. So they're going to have
a very good point. They have to be, and they gladly are, a lot of them.
And they can be. You can't, as an Adventist pastor, they really frown upon that.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on Adventism, not just not having the gospel, but being anti-gospel?
They add too much to it. Like when we were at church on Sunday, they're baptizing people, and it's just like, it's a baptism. There's not a certificate you have to sign. You're not sworn into membership. It's that easy. The gospel is supposed to be easy and simple. And I like the analogy of, so if you're traveling and somebody's built a beautiful freeway, but you're like, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to bushwhack with a machete and go through the woods right next to it. And the person who built this freeway for you is like, what are you doing? I built this freeway for you. You're actually going to get there. You can try and do it the hard way, but here's the easy way. Why are we trying to do it the hard way?
Yeah. It's like the side road through the jungle.
With a machete, and in Australia, not in Indiana. There's nothing in nature that's trying to kill us in Indiana, but apparently in Australia there are poisonous stuff.
In my backyard,
nothing like that
there's redbacks, and in my roof right now is a snake that I can hear, and I kind of don't want to get rid of it because it keeps any mice problems down.
My husband would need to move, but anyway, go ahead.
That Adventist being anti-gospel, I'm still processing that. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I'm coming more and more to the reality it is, and I'm struggling with that because my entire life was part of that. Trying to teach in that system, and so it's just hitting real as well. But the more I pray, the more I study, the more I'm coming to that conviction that it is anti-gospel, and it's challenging because all our families are still in the church, and realizing they're part of that, and their experience is short of God's ideal by far, of the assurance of salvation. So I don't honestly know how to answer that. It's a great question. Hopefully,
it infers also that it's not just a benign religion, that what we gave our best years to was in some way influencing people to come into a trap. And that's a hard thing to admit and
It is.
reconcile with. And when I chatted to John about it, and I said, how come you can still be a part of something like that? Because surely that's got to play on your mind. But he is so happily ensconced in this total. It's almost like another denomination. They've got their own church and gathering, and even though they do send their tithes back to the mothership. But I'm sure in the wee hours he wakes up sometimes going, "Oh, am I somehow contributing?" Because I don't. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, in my local church, it's fine and wonderful. We just say Happy Sabbath, and we hug a few trees, and we hippie Jesus lovers, and we enjoy haystacks and potluck." But the reality is, what about kids that you're bringing in by birth and people that you're bringing in via evangelism? Adventism, you might have your nice, happy little go-lucky local church, your happy, clappy, love Jesus church, but there's a Ted Wilson's releasing 1 billion great controversies onto the planet, and how do you avoid? So you bring people in, and you go, we've got a nice little safe space here, but there's minefields all around you. I think there's a level of responsibility you have as an Adventist, if it is anti-gospel, to somehow come to terms with that, because you are actually enabling and promoting something that's quite harmful potentially.
Yeah, it's really the anti-gospel aspect of it is clearly adding the works to it, which are salvific in the Adventist view, as we understand. The Sabbath front and center. The dietary. That works itself in, and all the other Adventist nuances. For me, the biggest thing was coming to grips that Saturday was not that. Even as I began to leave the Adventist church, I still had this conviction that Saturday has to play into this, because that's what Adventism teaches so strong. And so that was a big struggle of mine until about a year ago. I had to come to some type of grips. Not that I had to keep the Sabbath for salvation per se, but yet, I still had this Adventist mentality that the Sabbath has to play in here, and some way, somehow. And I found Dale Ratzlaff's book, Sabbath in Christ, so freeing. And that was what finally unlocked what I needed to unlock. And I'm sure there's other good resources that you can share, but for those who are still in the Adventist church, tied into the Sabbath, because the two are impossible to separate. That's just the reality. If it wasn't for the Sabbath, there would be no Seventh-day Adventist church, in my opinion. Realizing that it's not about the day. If you want to worship on Sabbath, that's fine. You can worship on Sunday, Wednesday, Tuesday. It's all good. And that's going to come across as fighting words, I'm sure, for maybe even some of the viewers who are, still believing. Early on, I saw when we started talking about the Sabbath, and I shared how important it was, if you come to, I think, understand the Bible in context and the gospel. I mean, if you want to look at someone who didn't keep the Sabbath, look at Jesus. Yeah. Well, when you can look at his life and interactions of how he interacted with the Sabbath, he blew up the Jewish laws and traditions.
Yes, he did not.
And that's ultimately, as you read the gospel, it's not wrong to say that's a significant reason why they crucified him, because of how he didn't keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And yet Adventists are tied in of having to keep the Sabbath. Yeah. That Jesus showed it wasn't all about the Sabbath. It was about him.
Yeah.
All about Jesus. Sorry.
People say that, he no, don't apologize. I love it. People say, but Jesus kept the Sabbath. You'll find that he didn't keep the Sabbath the ways the Pharisees wanted him to keep the Sabbath. And that brings us into a whole other conversation on the Sabbath and the covenants, and Adventists not understanding that the cross entered and ushered in a new connection with God,
Yeah.
and that Christ wasn't perfect so that you could emulate it, but he was perfect because the sacrifice requires a perfect lamb
Yes.
to make the sacrifice atonement, meaningful. And so he ushered in a whole new era. And it seems to me that Adventism is trying to take people back. So, I mean, if you really want to keep the law that the Pharisees had, I think there's 613. There's many Sabbaths. There's different mentions of the Sabbath. And yet Ellen White saw circled in vision around the fourth commandment
Oh, wow.
that,
Yes.
that this is about salvation. And it's very clear that Adventism's official teachings are legalistic. I want to just chat a little bit about the Sabbath, but we'll just end the last little bit of our conversation with a couple of comments. Josh C. writes, unfortunately, the SDA Church thinks they're God's representatives here on earth, but they're just another Christian cult, but definitely subtle. Dr. Walter Martin was confused as to what they were, and that's because he was hoodwinked, and perhaps well-meaning leaders at the time in the 50s, they heard that him and Barnhouse were about to include them in the kingdom of the cults, or whatever, the repressing of it, or a whole new book on the cults, and they didn't want that, so they confused him with their message and made him think, well, maybe Adventists actually are. But towards the end of his life, and obviously in those Ankerberg shows, he was truly starting to doubt, and was saying publicly that he felt, hang on a second, you guys tricked me. So that was Josh. And Rochelle also said the SDA education system really is organized to keep people in the system.
Yep, it is.
High school, I was told as a woman I could only be a missionary, nurse, teacher, or pastor's wife, or else God would hate me.
Wow.
See, it's the other thing is that whole suppression of women thrown in there as well. We could talk for hours, but we're probably gonna, and I'd love to have you guys back each week now for the foreseeable future. I'll be doing first interview of the week with looking at Adventism, interviewing different guests. The next day will be looking at the Glacier View Des Ford series, because I think it's so important to have that one out there in the public. Folk like, that was 5 years ago we did that season, and there's thousands of people that have joined the group since then and have never even watched it. So it was a seminal occurrence at the time, an event that shaped my whole life into a new direction. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then the third program of the week is the Gospel Fellowship, which you guys I'd love to speak at one day in very near future. So get that going in your mind. Yeah. I think you'd both be able to contribute. So I would love that as well, because there are people really hungry for the gospel without the SDA lens. So what I'm saying in a long way is would love to have you back, and that I think it's the Tuesday night, 6 p.m. is the time slot for these kind of interviews now weekly. So let's look at our diaries. So I want to just get a touch on the Sabbath one before we say farewell, because in what way, and if you think it's something you'd rather go away and research more, that's fine. But in what ways do you think Adventists who say, hey, look, it says in the Bible clearly, keep the Sabbath, and the gospel Adventists who are, hey, the Sabbath's an important ingredient to our special gem of Adventism, in what ways are they misconstruing the whole Sabbath teaching? And like I said, if you feel that's a conversation for another time, that's fine. But I thought we could touch on it.
Yeah, I think it's great to touch on it now. For me, it's in the covenants. Ultimately, understanding the new covenant versus the old covenant. Ultimately, God's covenant with Abraham, God's covenant with Moses, and ultimately the new covenant and how it relates. And obviously it would take more time than we have really to flush that out. But, is Saturday the Sabbath? Yes, absolutely. I don't think I don't think you would argue with that either, Peter, that Saturday is the Sabbath. The question comes in, is it mandatory today for followers of Christ in the new covenant? And I simply don't believe that it is. It was for the Jews. It was the sign of the covenant God had with the children of Israel at Sinai. But the new covenant writes God's laws on our hearts. And that's not the 10 Commandment laws as Adventist. I no longer believe that's the 10 Commandments laws as Adventist teaches. When Jesus says a new commandment I give you, that when Adventism read law and read commandment, they read Sabbath almost exclusively. It's just how we're taught. And good theology and a systematic theology doesn't hold up to that. And when you can take Ellen White out and say, okay, if I can get away from Ellen White, where, if I used to believe that she was the prophet and she had this vision of the 10 Commandments circled in heaven, and you just come back and read the Bible systematically. Yes, the children of Israel kept the Sabbath. They were in the 10 Commandments, but that is not God's eternal law as Seventh-day Adventists teach. I no longer believe. And so we find our Sabbath in Jesus, which is our eternal rest, is where I'm at, and where I found freedom and I believe biblical truth to confront the error that the Sabbath is eternal. It's God's one mark that will be keeping the Sabbath in heaven. When you really start looking at that from the outside, man, it does not hold up to good, solid biblical study. And when you talk to non-Adventists who just have never seen it as an issue, they don't have a good response to it because it's never been part of something they've had to think about. Because they have freedom in Christ and they're not caught up on the legalism and the law. If that makes sense, or any clarifying questions on that, or
no, that's great. And I think let's do a program in a few weeks if you guys are up for it on the Sabbath.
I think that'd be great.
I think it's kind of it's one of the biggest taboo topics for gospel Adventists to think about.
It was for me, and this is relatively new, but it's something that was critical for me to work through, and it's critical for any person who's in the Adventist church to realize there is an answer. I did not believe there was an answer until a year ago, because I was so closed-minded and
felt like a gray area.
It was, and it's no longer gray for me. And I apologize to Adventists maybe watching this who are ready to argue their points. But there is biblical evidence and biblical truth that contradicts the Adventist teaching and cultish doctrines. And investigative judgment. I mean, that's a whole nother thing that plays into that, which could be a whole nother program. And I'm sure you've done that many times.
And when liberal, progressive, revisionist, gospel, Big Tent, cultural Adventists, I've just added a new one, talk about these things, the investigative judgment, they will often say, well, I don't believe anything supernatural happened that night. I spoke to a guy recently, very high up in the SPD, which is the division over here, South Pacific Division. And he said, I don't believe that. And I said, wow, you'd lose your job if you came on my show, because he was thinking about coming on the program, and he's declined because he knows there's too many things he'd say that would make him lose his job. He's currently employed at the high levels. And he said, well, I don't believe it happened that night, but it was around that time. And I thought, oh, now you're just playing, you're just, you're just kind of shifting the goalposts there, because Ellen White was clear that Miller's dates were accurate, but not only was she clear as an inspirational person, and yeah, she made mistakes, but she was clear that God told her that specifically. So if you're going to question that doctrine, you have to question Ellen White's authority.
It all crumbles. Ellen White is the glue that holds it all together, is what I've come to realize. And when that crumbles, the entire system crumbles. That was my experience, and well, our experience.
Yeah.
I did find another YouTube channel that's not, and I think Miles went on this channel and talked about Adventism, and the channel is called Defending the Biblical Roots, and it's to fight against the Hebrew roots movement, where people are kind of becoming Jewish Christians kind of thing.
All right.
And what I like about this is it's talking about the Torah and the Old Testament. And because there are many people outside of the Adventist movement who are looking towards the festivals and the feasts and Saturday Sabbath and all this stuff from a Hebrew roots movement. So this comes at it from a different angle. And he has some really good videos about the Sabbath and the covenants and everything, because he's a Christian who is fighting against the Hebrew roots movement as well. So you can probably find him by looking on Miles's.
What's it called again?
I believe it's called Defending the Biblical Roots.
Yeah, I might
If
try.
Miles is still on, he can jump on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a couple of comments from the audience. Then I do want to ask, so Terry and Carrie, just ponder thinking back of what kind of awareness you had about the 1980s Glacier View and how many pastors left the church or were forced to leave the church at that time. Over here, over 200, America, over 200. We'll just have a quick reflection on that in a moment. And if there's no memory or any knowledge of it, that's fine. I'll just encourage you to watch my weekly Des Ford shows, because that was a monumental opportunity for the church to not continue in the direction. They had a chance in 1919. You've no doubt read about the conference minutes there. They had a chance maybe in 1888. They had a chance in Questions on Doctrine, 1957. But the last chance, and there's been no other sign of opportunities since then, was Des Ford and Glacier View. That was the last nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned, for there being an opportunity for Adventism to break away from their legalistic roots. That's why it's such a significant thing. And when you listen and learn about that era, you find out that the politics of Adventism are cruel and harsh and not Christian. Rochelle writes, keeping the Sabbath contributes to your salvation is anti-gospel.
True.
There you go, yeah. It's also why I believe SDAism is anti-faith, because if you believe keeping Sabbath saves you, you don't need faith. That's a good point, Rochelle.
If we could keep everything in the law, Jesus wouldn't have had to die for us.
Oh, yeah, wow. Carrie, that's amazing. Fourth commandment, always the idol for Adventists. Say again what you just said, Carrie.
I said, if we could keep the law perfectly, Jesus wouldn't have had to die.
So it's what's the point? You're actually taking away the full reason of the whole point of the cross.
Yep.
Wow.
Doesn't mean we get to go, do whatever we want, but
no.
Yeah.
That's exactly like people. That's a whole other thing people misunderstand.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something we've referred to a bit. Josh C. writes again, yeah, Dr. Martin found out his debate with the SDA pastor, which is the one we've been talking about. Pastor William G. Johnson on the Anchor Show has shown that. I don't know if you guys are aware, but in my episode with Bill Johnson, in 1984, he almost began the trend or perpetuated what was already being said. He literally said on that show, he said those at Glacier View could not find light in the teachings of Des Ford. The majority did not find light, is what he said. not mocking, but Adventist apologists often have this nice way of talking just softly and lovingly towards you. So
Right.
in my show, he revealed the lie at the center of Glacier View. He said the majority did agree with the teachings. Not only that, there was a consensus statement that they read out and voted on, and even Des Ford said, I can go along with that. So it wasn't till the afternoon that day, on the Friday, the last day of Glacier View, Kangaroo Court, that they wheeled out another 10-point statement, not publicly, not in the group, not voted on, that Des in all conscience couldn't go against. And that's what became the tool that kicked him out and defrocked him. So these guys, so that was 40 years later, Bill Johnson admits that what he'd said in 1984 was wrong. And not only was it wrong, it was the exact opposite. It was a complete lie. So how many other lies have we been told?
Yeah.
And we just happily go along because, hey, these guys speak nicely and are lovely people. So I don't know if did you guys know that?
I only knew about any of the Des Ford stuff once I started honestly listening to your channel, because when did Glacier View happen?
1980, August.
I was 2.5 years old when that happened.
But that's what I was kind of getting at. I
So-
knew you were both too young to have experienced it. I mean, I was
remember
only like 16, but my question is how that it was such a monumental moment as you became pastoral couple. It was hidden from you even then.
Absolutely. In seminary, it was breezed over, and most of us there, we're too young to remember much of it. I was born in 76, so at that time, in seminary, I was talking about, hey, ultimately that the investigative judgment came under this, and the church worked through it, and Ford left, and a few pastors left. That was about all I knew about it until recently. So it wasn't something that I knew anything about that was ever talked about, even as a pastor, and even in seminary. To the younger generations of pastors, it was just brushed away and forgotten about.
I remember hearing maybe a few little bits about it when I was a kid, but it wasn't ever.
It wasn't a big deal.
Wasn't a big deal. I mean, I remember them talking about Ford, but honestly, I was a little kid in my own happy little Adventist bubble that nothing really negative was said about Adventism, because I was surrounded by Adventists.
Yes, exactly. Well, and even with season 2, I was offered big money. Did you say Michigan is where you?
Yeah, Carrie's from Michigan.
I grew up there. Yeah.
There's an Adventist. Anyway, someone there from Michigan offered me big money to give them all the exclusive access and rights to season 2. Like, I'm talking $30,000-$40,000. Have I told people this before?
I haven't heard it.
But they were a very conservative group of people, and they would have shelved it. Now, here's me thinking at the time, no, and I didn't. I, of course, didn't take the money. Of course, it's there in the private group at Facebook. But it's harder to find because Facebook, you go, we're searching, and way down here, and it's like hundreds of interviews ago. I've done over 350 interviews. It's hard to find season 2. But
I'd be curious to know who that was, or what organization.
I'll tell you off air. But
okay. I want to know.
But and it was through someone acting on their behalf. So
sure.
Yeah. So but it hit me only a couple of weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago, that here we are 5 years later. I felt like this was a huge, amount of information that was going to really rock the church, and it did for that 86 episodes. There was a huge amount of interest in it, but it's gone again. So that's why I'm doing this live every week, putting it there. And for example, next week, John Godfrey is going to watch his interview with me. So we're going back to each one so that each one is out there to this current audience that I've got. And hopefully this time it's going to really be the bomb that it it should have been back then.
More people are questioning and searching because of just recent events and with COVID
Yeah.
and people sitting at home and getting bored and Googling stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
You
Yeah,
know, that's
that's right.
kind of what happened with me,
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah. Oh, lockdown and COVID changed everything.
Mhm.
In some ways, in a good way for this kind of stuff. Look, we will leave it there. I've really loved our conversation. We've gone over 2.5 hours, and it feels like 10 minutes.
It does.
And
It's going
Yeah.
by really fast.
I've got so many more questions I want to ask. Those watching, please send up love hearts and likes, and those who would like to support what I am doing, really could benefit from the odd donation. You can support the channel by scanning that QR code there, or you can go to PayPal and just make a donation there. It really helps. I'm doing at least I do 3 shows a week, at least 10 hours on this, and as I've said often, you guys, I do it for free. I love it so much, but I have bills to pay and little mouths to feed, and a roof to keep over our head. And as I've been entering into this, the Des for 45 years later, redoing a lot of these shows, it's taking me a lot of extra time. So I'm now expecting to do at least 15 hours a week. I love it, as I said, but if anyone's got any spare loose change, a couple of dollars here and there, it really adds up and really helps. So I'd really appreciate if people just took the time to do that. So yeah, we will leave it there, but let's write to each other and plan a time to talk on the Sabbath. And those watching that cultural Adventists, gospel, liberal, whatever kind of Adventists that feels that they've grasped the gospel within Adventism, I invite time, and we'll have Terry and Carrie on the show talking about the Sabbath. So that gives you a little bit of homework there, you guys, and we'll look forward to having you back. Did you have any last thoughts you wanted to kind of close on?
No, this has been great, Peter. It's helped me as we continue to process our where we're at, and coming out of Adventism from our entire lives, and working for the church, and this has been a healing conversation for me personally. I can share, and so thank you for being part of our journey as we journey together in Christ.
Thank you so much, you
second that.
guys. Thank you so much, and look forward to chatting to you again very soon. See everybody. See you all tomorrow.
Bye-bye.